This is Healthcare Now Radio's Interviews Now. Thanks for listening in. I'm Carol Flagg, your host for today's episode. You can follow the show on Twitter using hashtag InterviewsNOW to join the conversation. And of course, follow Healthcare Now Radio at HC Now Radio. In this fast-paced, ever-changing landscape we call healthcare delivery, who can we trust to tell us the good, the bad, or what's happening now? We're here to help you sort out these issues with thought leaders in the know. On this episode, I talk with Stephanie Crabb, the co-founder and principal at Immersive, a healthcare data lifecycle management company. Our conversation today will focus on the emerging role of the Chief Data Officer and data governance best practices. Stephanie, thanks for joining me today.
It's a delight to be here, Carol. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. Before we get started, tell our audience a little bit about yourself and how you got into health IT.
Well, I always saw myself going into the healthcare profession. I started in college pre-med, as many do, and I found my trajectory actually into medical social work and worked in that field for a bit of time, but I also was a healthcare policy person too. That was what I did my master's in. And, kind of through over time of being involved in different aspects of healthcare in the year 2000, sort of at the peak of the .com era, I found myself at WebMD and started to do work in the healthcare IT space and haven't looked back since.
Wow, WebMD, they were one of the first. I remember those days.
Yeah, it was way back in the day. And, and it was really the very first the beginnings of really digitization in healthcare at that time, aside from sort of consumer content, which was one side of the company. The other side of the company, was around automating referrals and things of that nature, the early first generation EDI transactions. So I got to see, something very foundational and then have, lived through the beginnings of, the EHR and now where we are with big data.
Yeah, and I would say WebMD really was the start of this whole topic that people are talking about, this consumerism of healthcare. Don't you agree?
Absolutely. I totally see that as the first real disruptor in terms of consumerism. And it was a very, very interesting time to be living, in that space. I remember talking to physicians and physician leaders that we were working with at the time, where that was the beginning of patients coming in with stacks of paper that they had printed, right, from, self-diagnosing, using information that they found on the internet, either at WebMD or at Medscape, before there was Dr. Google, and how that changed the patient visit and the experience of the patient visit at the same time when we were in the middle of the rise of managed care and those visits were being, capped at 15 or 20 minutes. Imagine what that experience was like for both patient, and provider at that time.
Yeah, it was a real watershed moment for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So our conversation today around the emerging role of the CDO, the Chief Data Officer, set the stage for our listening audience and start with how you define the role of the CDO.
Oh, that's such a great question. And really, it varies greatly. The rise of the CDO really started in other industries in earnest in the late 2000s, but we haven't seen the CDO role really in healthcare, until very recently, the last 2 or 3 years. And, there's not a standard job description. Few in healthcare really define the role the way we think it should be defined, which, we've derived from Gartner's work on the topic. Gartner advocates that the CDO role encompasses enterprise information management, digital innovation, and all of the things sort of in the analytics continuum that we probably recognize more in healthcare today. We agree that the Office of the CDO, or the Data Management Office, sort of serves as the locus of control for data and information lifecycle management. That means that the CDO's team includes digital health leaders, EIM leaders, as well as leaders in the traditional analytics, BI, data quality, MDM spaces that I think probably most of our listeners are most familiar with. So that's kind of what, a little bit of kind of the nuts and bolts of the role.
Yeah. You mentioned that the rise of the CDO really started in other verticals before it before healthcare. I'm just curious, was that an extension of the rise of big data? Is that where this particular leadership role stems from?
Absolutely. And you think about those industries that have preceded us, right, in big data. It's been in finance, it's been in retail, where, those verticals have really recognized the power of data as an asset. And in thinking about the CDO role, let's think a little bit first about what the business sort of has wanted, needed, or expected, from this role. And that's changed a lot over this period of time as well. What started as sort of data quality, reliability of data and access, and a little bit on business agility and enhanced decision making and enabling that deeper in the organization has really now become something very, very different. Both Gartner and Experian have done CDO studies since 2015. And, those early drivers for the CDO role were largely risk management driven, whether that was managing risk in all of these big technology projects as they were sort of preparing data for bigger analytics, quality issues, again, related to sort of big data, and compliance as more regulatory requirements around the globe evolved. Fast forward to today, and the CDO role is really being created specifically to drive revenue through both operational efficiency and new growth. In healthcare, that's translated into things like new service lines, new relationships, innovation in contracting, and now, as we've just seen in the last couple of weeks, information monetization, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit before we end this call.
Yeah, and the CDO role, this is at least in today's landscape, primarily something you see at the hospital or large health organization system level, correct?
Yes, we also see CDOs in life sciences and pharma and payer in the payer landscape. So, as we we think about the entire industry and sort of all of the entities and segmentation within the industry, like those organizations that have, typically been a bit more data-driven, have had more of the data at their fingertips, have been the early adopters of a CDO role, but certainly we're seeing this role rise in the provider side, but more specifically with large organizations for sure.
Yeah. And of course, most of us are, our audience and me in general, and most people are really, I guess, familiar or think we know what the Chief Information Officer, the CIO, does in healthcare. We think we do. So talk a little bit about how the CDO and the CIO roles are different, and where is the division of labor?
Sure, that's a great question. I think any healthcare CIO would tell you that their job is vastly different today than it was 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I really take exception to those that say that the average healthcare CIO is just not up to the diversified challenge of the role, and that it's this that has sort of led to the proliferation of the IT suite. I don't think that at all. In our work, we come in contact with CIOs of organizations, large and small, of varying complexity, and many of them have the appetite and the aptitude to do the work. They just simply don't have the bandwidth to do all of the work. I think about IT or IS, depending on how that organization, has sort of created that in their organizations, like any other discipline that's evolved and matured over time, to reveal that there are specializations within that discipline. Some CIOs love the foundational ops functions of IT, and that's what they're best at. It's the niche that they carve for themselves, and they're happy for others to take on other functions. This is what really gave rise to positions like the CTO, the CMIO, the CNIO, et cetera, over the last decade or so. Other CIOs really love the strategy of information services delivery. We're innovating through technology. And this has given rise to the other CDO role that you hear about in healthcare, the Chief digital officer.
Oh, right,
We
right.
could right. We could talk. We could have a whole separate conversation about the chief digi officer. But some CIOs, right, have moved into those roles. The chief data officer, to I think most of industry, is exclusively focused on optimizing the strategic use of data and information. And what we have in healthcare is a data use deficiency. We have a lot of data. We believe that it has a purpose. We believe in that purpose, but we haven't quite figured out how to put it all to work in a productive way. At its core, this is what the CDO does. Over the last several months, we've been interviewing CIO, CDO dyads. And what we hear from them is pretty universal. The CIO enables the technology environment such that the CDO knows that he or she can rely upon those source data systems and infrastructure to deliver the data that he or she needs. And if you look at some of the studies from Experian and Gartner and others, they carve sort of this tension and this contentious role between the CDO and the CIO. But I'll tell you, in healthcare, our experience, we're not really seeing that tension. And I think maybe it's because we've learned from, other industries and those that have gone before us that it does not need to be a contentious relationship. And some CIOs are actually moving into these CDO roles. So I think it's really more about the maturity of information services, what our organizations need, and then having the right complement of roles in the organization to do that, and having people both choose the work and creating those opportunities for them to specialize.
Yeah. So those driving factors that you talk about with the proliferation of the CDO in healthcare systems, obviously so many things in my mind pop up.
Right, and that's really why the CDO needs a team. To have sort of the CDO as a data advisor to the organization really shortchanges what the function of data management under a senior executive can do, and the power of really the role. And again, more importantly, it's about cultivating the function. So, most organizations have gone out of the gate really quickly on, big data and analytics. And a lot of organizations sort of have sort of the de facto VP of analytics or a chief analytics officer, and they've coalesced, some of the data analysts kind of in a team, around that kind of a person. But they're really not doing the full spectrum of, data and information lifecycle management. They're really creating the analytics engine for the organization. The CDO has that responsibility, but much, much more than that.
It strikes me that we'll be seeing more than a few CDOs at HIMSS in 2019.
Oh, I think you can count on it. I think you can count on it. It's so lovely to see these roles being established in organizations, and these sort of finding each other across the industry, which has been the fun part of interviewing them. They all know, they're starting to know each other, and they're starting to compare notes with each other. And again, then we sort of have the chief digi officer in there, which is also, the role is emerging at the same time, and they're kind of playing in that same sandbox, trying to figure out their own boundaries, their own contributions, how the sum can be greater than the parts.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Interviews Now, and our guest today is Stephanie Crabb, and we're talking about the emerging role of the Chief Data Officer and data governance best practices. So Stephanie, you talk about the CDO as the data stewards in healthcare organizations. What are or should be the top priorities today for the CDO?
Oh my goodness. So I think that we should take a look at really how is the CDO being measured to answer that question. And the core responsibilities that we see coalesce around things like defining the enterprise data and analytics strategy, overseeing, data and analytics initiatives, serving as that digital advisor, ensuring data and information reliability and value, leading the data governance program, managing the data science. We'll talk a little bit about, I think, AI and machine learning and and personalized medicine a little bit too. All of those things, enabling those things. But the CDO, interestingly, is being measured on things that there's not really a direct line from those core responsibilities to how they're being evaluated. And those things are kind of as follows. Have efficiencies been realized? Have expenses been reduced? Have new products or services been introduced? Have revenues increased? Are we in a better competitive position organizationally? Has business risk been reduced? Has customer experience improved? I mean, when you think about, those kind of core responsibilities around strategy and overseeing analytics and those kinds of things, they don't necessarily map to this like perfectly straight line to all of these things that are really around financial performance, I guess, for lack of a better word. So, what's really interesting is that's what boards and fellow CXO suite leaders are expecting from the CDO. What's really interesting, just to kind of then put it in further perspective, Gartner's third annual CDO study, which was published last year, a couple of important metrics. The average CDO manages a budget of $8 million, manages a team of 29 direct reports and 28 indirect reports, and 36% of them have direct P&L responsibility. If we're to sort of read the tea leaves of some of the trends, and especially as healthcare tries to learn those lessons from industries that are more mature with a CDO role and with a data management function, then the healthcare CDO, the person contemplating that role, organizations establishing that role, have a vision that is exclusively focused on growth, revenue growth in particular. And that obviously is not a job for the faint at heart.
That is a sizable budget for a healthcare organization, and certainly a big staff. Are you seeing that healthcare organizations are shifting people around to fill the complement for the CDO, or are these new additions and new budgets?
Well, in some cases it's net new. In other cases it's a shift. So for some organizations that have had some of the expertise inside of the IT organization, some of the expertise out in the business, they're looking to say, there really is something more valuable if we bring these stakeholders, if we bring these skills and talents together and centralize and consolidate them, in a data management office under a dedicated data leader. Those organizations that have organized themselves that way clearly are outperforming those that sort of have a more hybrid or federated model. So if there is a page to be taken out of a playbook, of success both within early adopters in healthcare and in other industries, it is to sort of take those pieces and parts from across the organization and centralize and consolidate something new. And whether that is then just simply the reallocation, of that budget into a new cost center, many organizations have sort of taken that path, or organizations that have said, just like we might have been late implementers of an EHR, we're maybe going to, plan for this in 3 to 5 years, they're planning on creating a new cost center with a budget and all of those kinds of things in order to establish this function and make sure that it's resourced correctly from the get-go.
Well, it definitely doesn't sound like a straight line. It sounds like a pretty big Venn diagram to me of circles and triangles.
That or a spider chart. It's the interesting thing about it, though, is that it's very, very exciting to see the energy around data, as an asset.
Yeah.
And it's also, when we think about the money that organizations have spent on electronic health record and health information exchange and other technology enablement, to create and collect data beyond anything that we could have ever done in the paper chart. It's because we obviously have a belief that there is a deeper value to data to improve care, reduce cost, accelerate cures. Someone needs to drive the bus, and that's not, something that, a person does alone. And I think organizations are looking at what they have internally, how they're organized already, to be able to make that shift as seamlessly as possible, but also, in as expeditiously as possible to really realize that value, because if not, they're going to be left behind.
This idea that we have to, the EHR it was like the starting point, not the end point of the game, right? And that in population health
Right.
management tools and all this software that you're right, these healthcare organizations have invested in to collect data, and now being in a place in the industry where there is some real practical uses for that data.
No, it's absolutely true. And, and a CDO doesn't, do it alone. And honestly, where most organizations have started, has been with sort of voluntary data governance programs. So a lot of organizations have had data governance or pieces and parts of data governance now, for a while. And there's a lot of value that is created out of data governance, but they realize there's sort of a tipping point with this voluntary data governance organization and program, which is to say, at some point to get the most out of your data, you've got to sort of formalize that beyond what any sort of voluntary data governance program can accomplish on its own.
Yeah. So what best practices do you recommend for healthcare organizations as they evaluate and formalize their data governance practices?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is create a data governance leader position. It's almost sort of a precursor to the organization formally investing, in data management. The first baby step for us that we like to see organizations do is to create a DG leader position, and that is a dedicated, funded role to lead that voluntary data governance structure. It really ensures that it's a productive use of people's time, and ensure that we're growing experience and capability. The second thing I would say is adopt a framework, especially because data governance is a voluntary activity, and we're bringing stakeholders together with very different backgrounds and comfort levels with data and information. A framework helps to establish sort of a common understanding of scope, vocabulary, from which we can prioritize what we're doing and we can measure what we're doing. They really provide a valuable foundation and context for the work. There are a lot of organizations that started, kind of along the journey of data governance, and it's sort of like a cottage industry, cobbling it together as they went along through a few people that were really interested in it, and so they kind of self-studied. Well, you know what? There's a lot of great discipline, documentation, best practices that are out there in frameworks. We have a framework. AHIMA has its information governance framework. HIMSS has its data analytics adoption model. There are lots of different frameworks out there, and so it kind of anchors the work, and it also helps build the competencies of the individuals that are participating. Those are the two things we would say, bar none. Do those two things first.
Yeah, you don't have to reinvent the wheel here, right? There are resources out there. Exactly, right. Yeah. So believe it or not, we're winding down here, but we've got a few minutes left in our time together today. And talk about the future, crystal ball. So how do you see data's role in healthcare delivery evolving over the next 3 to 5, 10 years down the road?
Oof. Well, I think we have a long way to go in a few areas, but there's so much excitement. I'll touch on maybe 3. The first is AI and machine learning.
Yeah.
Data fuels AI and ML. It's why we need to be relentless about data standards, data quality, and absolutely clear about those uses of data. We will fail a lot as we experiment with AI and ML. We don't have a lot of tolerance for failure in the industry, and you can see that angst, can't you, in so many of the articles that are being written, all the attention that's being placed on this topic. Just as an example, IBM has really taken the brunt of a lot of the bad PR, right, because of the early utilization of Watson in cancer care. And maybe that criticism is fair. I wrote this recently in one of our company LinkedIn posts. But the blame, certainly, some of the blame rests with our industry data ecosystem in its current state. We have got to get serious about data standards, adopting standards, not creating excuses for why one organization's data standard needs to be different than somebody else's, or we simply will not know why AI and ML are succeeding or failing and what to do next. So that's my first, and I think we've got a lot of running room and in that AI and ML space over the next 3, 5, 10 years. The second, of course, is personalized medicine. The more data we know, and this is not just genomics data, but core data from the EHR, social determinants of health data, the better we should be able to impact the health and wellness of an individual, anticipate health risks, and treat health problems that arise. How to weight that data or evaluate that data in that equation of personalized medicine. I try to think of like what my own personalized medicine pie chart might look like and what I already know from family history, what I know about, my first 50 years on this planet and everything else. I mean, what will be more valuable throughout a person's life at different stages of life? Well, that's in the art and the science, but better data and understanding how that data fits together for personalized medicine, again, I think is our next frontier 3, 5, 10 years. And then finally, the last thing I'd say is monetization. We sit on highly, highly valuable data. If we look at TrustWave's 2018 study on the value of data, the health record on the black market is worth $250. It is the single most valuable data source or data set in the world. How we monetize, whether it's raw data or whether it's analytics and insights, regardless of where we are in the industry, whether we're payers, whether we're third parties, whether we're providers, monetization of data is in our future. And so it's another area where organizations are going to have to figure out what those data and information products look like, how they're applied internally and externally. But monetization, I'd say, is the third piece that I would look at in my crystal ball of something that the industry is really going to have to wrestle with, but there's great opportunity there.
Stephanie, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a great conversation.
I enjoyed it, Carol. Thanks so much.
You can learn more about Stephanie Crabb and Immersive at immersive.healthcare and follow the company on Twitter at Immersive LLC and, of course, on LinkedIn. I want to thank our listeners for tuning in today. For more information about Interviews Now, visit our show's program page on www.healthcarenowradio.com and follow the station on Twitter at HCNowRadio. Until next time, if it's happening in healthcare and it's now, it's on Interviews Now.